5 years, and somehow this city still feels like home.
Why won't he even look at me?
Because some people never change.
Are you finally going to tell him the truth?
Not until he's ready to hear it.
I didn't come back to reopen old wounds. I came back because the truth has stayed buried long enough. Because nothing makes sense anymore.
Please, don't do this tonight.
The truth has waited long enough.
A billionaire returned to New York after disappearing for 5 years. He had the money, the power, and the truth that could destroy the lives of the people who betrayed him. Everyone expected revenge. Instead, he walked past his own brother without saying a single word. Why would a man who had lost everything choose silence when he finally had every reason to speak? The answer wasn't hidden inside his billions. It was buried in a promise he made years earlier, a promise so powerful that it changed the course of two brothers' lives forever. Some stories begin with a single mistake. Others begin with a single decision. But every once in a while, a story begins with a sacrifice so great that the people it was meant to protect never realized the price that was paid for them. This is one of those stories. At first glance, it looks like the remarkable rise of a billionaire who overcame impossible odds. But beneath the success lies a family divided by deception, a brother who chose silence over revenge, and a secret that remained buried for years. Before tonight is over, that secret will finally begin demanding answers. If this is your first time hearing about Jason Brooks, here's what you need to know. Jason and his younger brother, Jayden, grew up with very little. Raised by a hardworking single mother, they learned early that money could disappear overnight, but integrity was something no one could ever take away. Together they dreamed of building a better life, and they promised each other that no matter how successful they became, nothing would ever come between them. For years, they kept that promise. Then one person entered their lives, and everything changed. While attending college, Jason fell deeply in love with a young woman named Maria, whose loyalty never wavered even during the hardest seasons of life. Around the same time, another student named Clara quietly developed feelings for Jason. When he respectfully told her that his heart already belonged to Maria, Clara appeared to accept his decision. Instead, she slowly turned her attention toward Jayden. What followed wasn't one dramatic event, but a series of small manipulations that gradually drove the brothers apart. Suspicion replaced trust. Misunderstandings replaced honest conversations. And the family bond they had spent a lifetime building began falling apart piece by piece. When the accusations finally reached their breaking point, Jason made a decision that surprised everyone. Rather than expose Clara and destroy Jayden's happiness, he accepted the blame, packed everything he owned into a single worn suitcase, and quietly walked away. Maria chose to leave with him, believing that a future built on honesty was worth more than a comfortable life built on deception. With no job, no money, and no clear future, Jason started over in a city where nobody knew his name. There, one unexpected act of kindness led him to an elderly businessman who saw something in him that no one else had noticed. Years of hard work, discipline, and unwavering integrity transformed Jason from a struggling young man into one of America's most respected business leaders and eventually one of its newest billionaires. Now, 5 years later, fate has brought him back to New York. Standing only a few feet away is the younger brother who still believes Jason abandoned him. Watching from across the room is the woman who has spent years hoping the truth would never catch up with her. Tonight isn't just about a reunion. It's about a promise, a sacrifice, and a truth that has waited far too long to be told. And before this night comes to an end, one sentence will begin changing everything. The moment Jason Brooks walked past his younger brother without saying a single word, something far more powerful than a family reunion began unfolding. To everyone inside New York's most prestigious charity gala, it looked like nothing more than a brief encounter between two strangers. Cameras continued flashing. Business leaders continued laughing. Reporters hurried toward the ballroom hoping to capture another photograph of America's newest billionaire. But standing motionless beneath the crystal chandeliers, Jayden Brooks felt as though the entire room had disappeared. 5 years of unanswered questions suddenly returned all at once. The brother he believed had abandoned his family without explanation had just looked directly into his eyes and chosen silence. Why? After everything Jayden had accomplished, after building an empire admired across the country, why would he return only to walk away again? And perhaps an even more troubling question lingered beneath the surface. Why did the one person who should have felt relieved to see Jayden alive suddenly look terrified? As the ballroom door slowly closed behind Jayden, Clara struggled to hide the fear spreading across her face. For years, she had convinced herself that the past would remain exactly where it belonged. Jayden had disappeared. Jayden had accepted the version of events she allowed him to believe. Life had moved forward. But now the one man capable of unraveling everything had returned, not as the struggling young man she remembered, but as one of the most respected businessmen in America. Wealth had given Jayden influence. Success had earned him credibility. If he decided to speak, people would listen. Maria noticed Clara's expression immediately. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't happiness. It was the unmistakable look of someone who suddenly realized a secret could no longer remain hidden forever. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Jayden couldn't take his eyes off the ballroom entrance. Every memory he had tried to bury over the past 5 years came rushing back with painful clarity. The long nights his older brother worked to help support the family. The promise they made as children that success would never separate them. The day Jayden quietly walked away carrying one worn suitcase without ever defending himself. Nothing about the man who had just entered that ballroom matched the story Jayden had believed for years. And somewhere inside the crowded hall, Jayden knew that before the night came to an end, one conversation, one unexpected revelation, and one carefully chosen sentence would force everyone involved to question everything they thought they knew about the past. The ballroom continued buzzing with celebration, but beneath the polished speeches and confident smiles, another story was quietly unfolding. The guests believed they had gathered to honor generosity, leadership, and remarkable business success. They saw Jayden Brooks as the billionaire whose companies had transformed industries and whose charitable work had earned admiration across America. To them, this evening was simply another celebration of achievement. But Jayden hadn't crossed the country, returned to New York, and walked into the same room as his younger brother for another award or another photograph. He came carrying something far heavier than wealth. He came carrying 5 years of silence. Every step he took through that ballroom brought him closer to a truth that could change several lives forever. Only 3 questions truly mattered now, although no one in the room realized it yet. Why had Jayden accepted blame years earlier without exposing the person responsible for destroying his relationship with Jayden? Why had Clara spent all those years carefully avoiding any conversation that might lead back to the day Jayden disappeared? And perhaps the most important question of all, why had Jayden chosen this particular night to return after remaining silent for so long? If revenge had been his goal, he could have returned years ago with money, influence, and public recognition already on his side. Instead, he waited patiently, saying nothing while building a life few people could have imagined. That decision suggested his return had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about something much deeper. Around the ballroom stood some of the most influential people in the country. Chief executives exchanged handshakes worth millions of dollars. Investors discussed future partnerships. National media personalities prepared interviews. Elected officials greeted distinguished guests, while respected philanthropists celebrated another successful fundraising event. One after another, important figures approached Jayden to congratulate him on his extraordinary achievements. They praised his leadership, admired his integrity, and spoke about the remarkable journey that had inspired countless entrepreneurs. Yet among hundreds of successful people gathered under one roof, only 4 individuals understood that the most significant event of the evening had nothing to do with business. Jayden, Maria, and Clara were standing at the center of a story that had begun years before any headline ever mentioned Jayden's name. Across the room, Jayden watched every conversation from a distance, searching for an opportunity to speak with the brother he no longer understood. Clara, however, noticed something else. Jayden wasn't behaving like someone returning to settle old scores. His calm expression, measured confidence, and quiet composure made him impossible to read, and somehow that frightened her even more. A man driven by anger could be predicted. A man driven by purpose was far more difficult to stop. Before anyone could discover the truth, the evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The loudest applause in the room wasn't for the charity itself. It was for the men almost everyone believed had achieved the American dream. Yet while hundreds of distinguished guests rose to their feet to honor Jayden Brooks, only one person in that ballroom understood that his greatest achievement had never been building a fortune. It had been carrying the weight of a painful truth without allowing it to destroy the people he still loved. As the applause echoed through the grand ballroom, Jayden smiled politely, shook hands, and thanked those welcoming him. But behind his calm expression was a quiet determination that had brought him back to New York for a reason far greater than public recognition. Before the evening was over, the carefully protected past that had remained silent for 5 long years would begin finding its voice. Jayden moved gracefully through the ballroom as business leaders, investors, philanthropists, and executives gathered around him, eager to congratulate the men whose remarkable journey had become one of the country's most inspiring success stories. Members of the charity board welcomed him as their guest of honor, while reporters from national news outlets and respected business magazines patiently waited for an opportunity to ask about his latest investments, international expansion, and charitable foundation. Every handshake celebrated his achievements. Every camera captured another image of the billionaire who had transformed adversity into extraordinary success. Yet despite the constant attention surrounding him, Jayden's focus quietly drifted back to the same place again and again. Across the room stood Jayden Brooks. Although Jayden never stared for long, Maria noticed something no one else seemed to recognize. No matter how many conversations demanded his attention, Jayden never completely lost sight of his younger brother. It wasn't the watchful gaze of anger. It was the quiet concern of an older brother who had spent years wondering whether the distance between them could ever truly be repaired. Jayden remained where he was, unable to reconcile the confident businessman standing before him with the brother he remembered leaving town carrying a worn suitcase and little else. Every time someone praised Jayden's leadership or described his generosity, another piece of the story Jayden had believed for years seemed to fall apart. If Jayden had truly been selfish, jealous, and unwilling to support his own family, why did everyone who knew him now speak about his honesty with such unwavering respect? The questions multiplied faster than the answers, and for the first time, Jayden began wondering whether he had misunderstood the most important chapter of his own life. No one felt that growing uncertainty more intensely than Clara. She watched every glance exchanged across the ballroom with increasing anxiety. Whenever Jayden appeared ready to move toward Jayden, she quickly redirected his attention with another introduction, another conversation, or another reason to remain where they were. She laughed when everyone else laughed, smiled when photographers approached, and carefully maintained the appearance of complete confidence. But inside, she understood something that no one else had yet realized. The longer Jayden remained in that ballroom, the greater the chance that years of carefully protected silence would finally begin giving way to the truth. Then, just as the evening appeared to be unfolding exactly as planned, an elderly guest studying Jayden from across the room slowly lowered his glass. His expression changed from polite curiosity to unmistakable recognition. After several quiet moments, he whispered to the person standing beside him, "I know that young man, and I remember the day we first met." Suddenly, the past was no longer content to remain buried. Some people become afraid the moment they lose control. Others become afraid the moment they realize the truth no longer belongs to them. As Clara watched Jayden Brooks moving effortlessly through the ballroom, shaking hands with influential business leaders and receiving the admiration of people whose opinions shaped industries, she understood that everything had changed. 5 years earlier, she had believed silence would protect her forever. Back then, Jayden was simply the older brother who left town without defending himself. Now he was a respected billionaire whose integrity had become part of his public reputation. If he chose to tell his story, it wouldn't sound like the excuse of a bitter man seeking sympathy. It would sound like the testimony of someone whose character had already been proven over time. For the first time since Jayden returned, Clara wasn't worried about seeing him. She was worried about who might believe him. Without drawing attention to herself, Clara quietly slipped away from Jayden and began following Jayden from a distance as he moved between conversations with investors, charity board members, and distinguished guests. She wasn't interested in the speeches or the celebration. She wanted answers. Had Jayden returned to expose her? Had he already spoken to someone? Was tonight carefully planned, or was it simply a reunion that had happened by chance? Every unanswered question increased her anxiety. Standing near a small group of investors, she overheard one executive praising Jayden's honesty, explaining that major financial institutions trusted him because he had built a reputation for doing the right thing even when it cost him personally. Another businessman nodded in agreement, adding that Jayson's word carried more weight than most signed contracts. Those comments struck Clara harder than she expected. Influence. Respect. Credibility. Jayson possessed all three now, and those qualities frightened her far more than his wealth ever could. If he finally decided to speak, people would listen without hesitation. Trying to regain a sense of control, Clara quietly reached for her phone. She scrolled through old conversations, deleting messages she suddenly wished had never existed. She placed a few discreet calls, speaking in short, careful sentences before quickly ending each conversation whenever someone walked nearby. Her composed smile returned each time she re-entered the crowd, but it disappeared the moment she believed no one was watching. She had spent years carefully protecting one version of the past, and now every decision she made reflected the fear that it might not survive the night. Maria noticed the change almost immediately. She remembered Clara well enough to recognize that this wasn't ordinary nervousness. Clara wasn't behaving like someone surprised by an unexpected reunion. She was behaving like someone trying to stay one step ahead of something she couldn't control. Maria quietly watched as Clara repeatedly glanced toward Jayson, checked her phone, and searched the ballroom with increasing unease. The pattern became impossible to ignore. While everyone else celebrated another successful charity gala, Maria quietly reached a conclusion of her own. Whatever Clara was hiding hadn't disappeared with time. It had followed her into that ballroom. And before the evening came to an end, Maria decided she was finally going to confront Clara and ask the one question that had remained unanswered for 5 long years. Some conversations are worth more than fortunes. Others arrive years too late. As Jayden Brooks watched the crowd surrounding his older brother slowly begin to thin, he realized he could no longer keep running from the questions that had followed him for 5 years. Success, promotions, and the comfortable life he had built had never managed to silence one painful thought. Why had Jayson really walked away without fighting for the family he claimed to love? Standing only a few steps apart inside one of New York's most elegant ballrooms, two brothers who had once promised never to leave each other behind were finally about to face the silence that had separated them for far too long. Neither of them realized their first conversation would end before the most important truth could finally be spoken. Jayden took a slow breath and quietly walked toward Jayson. Every step felt heavier than the last. Around them, conversations continued, glasses clinked together, and photographers searched for another memorable moment from the evening, but neither brother seemed to notice any of it. For a few long seconds, they simply stood facing one another. Time seemed to collapse beneath the weight of shared memories. Jayson saw the younger brother he had protected since childhood, the boy who once believed nothing could ever break their bond. Jayden saw the older brother he had convinced himself no longer cared, yet whose calm eyes now carried no bitterness, no resentment, and no desire to make him suffer. That quiet smile on Jayson's face unsettled him more than anger ever could. A man seeking revenge would have been easier to understand. A man offering peace after years of silence forced Jayden to question everything he thought he knew. Neither brother spoke immediately. The years between them seemed too heavy for ordinary words. Finally, Jayden broke the silence. His voice was calm, but the hurt he had buried for so long was impossible to hide. Why did you leave? It wasn't the question of a businessman speaking to another successful businessman. It was the question of a younger brother who had spent years believing he had been abandoned. Jayson looked at him for a long moment before quietly answering with words so simple that they carried even greater weight. I never wanted to leave. Jayden's expression changed instantly. Confusion replaced certainty. That single sentence contradicted everything he had believed for the past 5 years. If Jayson never wanted to leave, then why had he packed his suitcase? Why had he disappeared without explaining himself? Why had he never called? For the first time, Jayden began considering the possibility that someone else had been shaping his understanding of the past all along. Jayson could see those questions forming before a single one was spoken. He knew this was the moment he had imagined countless times, the opportunity to finally explain the sacrifice he had made to protect the only brother he had ever known. He opened his mouth, ready to tell the story he had carried alone for years. But before another word could be spoken, a cheerful voice interrupted from behind. A distinguished member of the charity board approached with several prominent guests, eager to introduce Jayson to a group of international investors waiting nearby. The moment was gone. Jayson politely acknowledged the interruption, while Jayden stepped back, frustration and uncertainty written across his face. One sentence had already changed everything. The next sentence might have changed even more. But once again, the truth would have to wait. Sometimes the most powerful truth is the one that is never spoken directly. It doesn't arrive as an accusation, an argument, or a confession. Instead, it quietly finds its way into the hearts of those who were never prepared to hear it. As Jason Brooks walked toward the stage, the audience expected another inspiring speech from one of America's most respected business leaders. They anticipated a story about determination, success, and leadership. What they didn't realize was that every word Jason was about to speak carried a meaning far beyond business. Hidden within his message was a lesson shaped by years of sacrifice, betrayal, and forgiveness. For one man sitting in the audience, those words would begin dismantling a version of the past he had believed for far too long. The chairman of the charity board warmly introduced Jason, praising not only his remarkable business achievements but also the generosity that had transformed countless lives through scholarships, community programs, and charitable investments. The ballroom erupted into another standing ovation as Jason stepped behind the podium. He waited patiently until the applause faded before offering a humble smile. Looking across the room, he thanked everyone for supporting a cause greater than personal success. Then, instead of speaking about profits, billion-dollar companies, or international expansion, he chose a very different subject. He spoke about character. He explained that success built without integrity eventually loses its value, but character remains long after titles, wealth, and recognition disappear. He reminded the audience that life often presents moments when doing the right thing comes with a painful personal cost, and those moments reveal who people truly are. After a brief pause, Jason turned his attention to forgiveness. He admitted that some wounds take years to heal and that not every misunderstanding can be corrected immediately. Sometimes, he said, protecting someone you love requires accepting a burden they may never understand. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't proving your innocence but choosing not to destroy another person's happiness, even when you've been deeply misunderstood. The ballroom fell into complete silence. No names were mentioned. No personal stories were revealed. Yet every sentence seemed to travel across the room and settle directly in front of Jayden Brooks. He found himself remembering conversations, arguments, and moments he had long accepted as settled. For the first time, doubt quietly entered his heart. What if the story he had believed for years had never been the complete story? Across the ballroom, Clara struggled to maintain her composure. Each sentence felt less like a motivational speech and more like a quiet reflection on the very past she had spent years trying to leave behind. Jason never looked toward her. He never hinted at her name. Yet somehow, she felt as though every word was exposing pieces of a truth only she fully understood. Her confident smile slowly disappeared, replaced by growing unease as she realized Jason wasn't attacking anyone. He was allowing integrity itself to speak on his behalf. That frightened her more than any accusation ever could. Jason concluded by saying that everyone deserves a second chance, not only to rebuild a career or recover from failure, but also to find the courage to face unfinished chapters with honesty when the time is finally right. The audience responded with thunderous applause, many rising to their feet, inspired by the humility of a man who had every reason to celebrate himself yet chose instead to celebrate compassion, forgiveness, and integrity. Jayden remained standing, applauding almost without realizing it, his mind consumed by questions he could no longer ignore. Then, just as the applause began to fade, an elderly guest slowly rose from his seat. His expression was solemn, his eyes fixed on Jason, as though he had finally decided it was time to tell a story that had remained untold for far too many years. There are moments when a lifetime of carefully protected lies begins to fall apart, not because someone finally exposes them, but because the truth quietly earns the respect of everyone in the room. Jason Brooks hadn't asked anyone to defend him. He hadn't revealed the sacrifices he had made or the accusations he had carried in silence. Yet as the applause following his speech slowly faded, someone who had witnessed his character long before the world celebrated his success made a decision that would change the course of the evening. What happened next wasn't planned by Jason, and it couldn't be stopped by anyone determined to keep the past hidden. Sometimes, the strongest witness isn't the person accused. It's the person who watched everything unfold from the very beginning. As guests prepared to return to their tables, the elderly businessman who had first believed in Jason slowly rose from his seat. His presence alone commanded immediate respect throughout the ballroom. Board members, executives, investors, and public officials turned their attention toward him as he accepted the microphone. Looking first at Jason, then across the audience, he smiled with quiet pride before speaking. He explained that many people admired Jason Brooks because of the companies he had built and the fortune he had earned, but those accomplishments were never the reason he trusted him. He told the audience that the first time they met, Jason wasn't arriving in a luxury vehicle or wearing an expensive suit. He was carrying a worn suitcase that contained almost everything he owned. Then he shared the story of the scattered documents that had blown across a busy sidewalk years earlier. While countless strangers hurried past, Jason and Maria stopped without hesitation, gathered every page, and asked for nothing in return. That simple act, he said, revealed more about Jason's future than any resume ever could. The businessman continued, recalling how Jason later returned a wallet containing thousands of dollars without considering for even a moment whether anyone would discover it had been lost. He spoke about the young employee who quietly accepted difficult assignments that others avoided, who stayed late to help struggling co-workers, and who protected the reputation of a colleague whose mistake could have ended a promising career. Promotion after promotion had been offered, he explained, but Jason often insisted that deserving members of his team be recognized alongside him because he believed leadership was measured by the people you lifted, not by the titles you collected. Finally, after a long pause, the elderly businessman looked directly at Jason and said words that settled over the ballroom with extraordinary weight. In all my years of building businesses and meeting remarkable people, Jason Brooks is the most honorable man I have ever known. For several seconds, complete silence filled the room. Then the audience rose together in a standing ovation unlike any that evening had witnessed. The applause wasn't celebrating another billionaire. It was honoring a man whose reputation had been built on integrity long before wealth ever entered his life. Across the ballroom, Jayden stood frozen. His mind drifted back through years of conversations with Clara, years of hearing Jason described as jealous, selfish, and unwilling to celebrate another person's happiness. Yet none of those accusations matched the men respected by everyone now standing before him. The pieces refused to fit together. If Jason truly lacked integrity, why had so many accomplished people entrusted him with their confidence? Why did every story describe sacrifice instead of selfishness? For the first time since his brother left home, Jayden allowed himself to ask the question he had spent years avoiding. What if Jason had been telling the truth all along? A few feet away, Clara watched the applause with growing panic, realizing that the foundation she had spent 5 years protecting had begun to crack before her eyes, and she no longer knew how to stop it. There comes a moment when the noise of the world finally fades, leaving only two people and the truth that has been waiting between them for years. For Jason Brooks and Jayden Brooks, that moment arrived not beneath the bright lights of the ballroom or in front of applauding guests, but in the quiet space beyond the celebration where success, wealth, and reputation no longer mattered. After 5 years of unanswered questions, there were no reporters to interrupt them, no business leaders waiting for introductions, and no audience expecting another inspiring speech. There were only two brothers standing face to face with a past neither of them could escape. Sometimes the hardest conversation isn't about what happened. It's about finding the courage to ask whether everything you believed has been wrong from the very beginning. As the celebration continued inside the ballroom, Jason quietly stepped into a peaceful terrace overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The cool evening air offered a brief escape from the endless congratulations and conversations. Moments later, he heard familiar footsteps behind him. He turned to find Jayden standing several feet away, his confident appearance now replaced by uncertainty. For the first time in years, Jayden wasn't approaching Jason as the brother who believed he had been abandoned. He was approaching him as someone searching for answers he could no longer ignore. The stories shared by the elderly businessman, the admiration shown by respected leaders, and Jason's own words about forgiveness had shattered the certainty he had carried for so long. Nothing matched the version of Jason he had accepted as truth. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was no longer filled with anger. It was filled with questions. Jayden slowly stepped closer before quietly speaking. His voice carried regret, confusion, and the weight of years that could never be recovered. Did I get everything wrong? The question lingered in the air. Jason looked into his younger brother's eyes for a long moment, seeing not the successful executive standing before him, but the little brother he had promised to protect when they were children. There was no satisfaction in Jason's expression. No desire to prove himself right. Only sadness for the years they had lost. He finally answered in a calm voice that carried more emotion than anger ever could. Some truths hurt more than lies. Jayden lowered his eyes, struggling to understand what those words truly meant. If the truth was more painful than the lies he had believed, then how much had Jason sacrificed by remaining silent all those years? Why would anyone choose to carry that burden alone? Jason took a slow breath, knowing the moment he had imagined for 5 years had finally arrived. He was ready to explain everything: the conversation Clara had hidden, the accusations he had accepted without defending himself, and the promise he made to protect Jayden's happiness even if it meant losing his own family. At last, the silence that had defined so much of their lives was about to end. But just as Jason opened his mouth to reveal the truth, hurried footsteps echoed across the terrace. Clara appeared at the entrance, her breathing uneven and her composure slipping for the first time that evening. Her eyes moved quickly from Jason to Jayden, instantly realizing what was about to happen. Without hesitation, she stepped between the two brothers. In that single moment, Jayden understood something he had never noticed before. Clara wasn't interrupting an ordinary conversation. She was trying to stop a truth she had feared for 5 long years. And as Jason calmly met her gaze, the night reached its most unforgettable turning point. Sometimes the most painful discoveries don't happen when someone finally tells the truth. They happen the moment you realize the story you've believed for years may never have been true at all. As Clara stepped between Jason Brooks and Jayden Brooks, the silence said more than any argument ever could. Jason had been only seconds away from answering the question that had haunted both brothers for years, yet once again, the truth remained just out of reach. Jayden looked from Jason to Clara, searching their faces for answers neither of them seemed ready to give. For the first time since that unforgettable night years earlier, certainty had disappeared. The version of the past he had defended for so long no longer fit the man standing in front of him. Every word spoken during the charity gala, every tribute paid to Jason's integrity, and every story shared by the people who had watched him build his remarkable life had begun breaking apart the image Jayden had carried in his heart. If Jason truly was the honorable man everyone described, then one question refused to disappear. Had he spent years judging the wrong person? Jason remained calm despite the growing tension. He had waited years for this moment, yet he still refused to expose Clara in front of strangers or humiliate the woman who had once become part of his family's life. Maria understood exactly what he was doing. She had watched him carry this burden for years, choosing silence over revenge even when speaking would have restored his reputation. That choice had cost him his relationship with his brother, years of unnecessary loneliness, and memories that could never be replaced. Yet standing there, Jason still believed that truth should heal before it destroys. Across the room, Clara realized she was running out of places to hide. The confidence that had protected her for so long was beginning to crumble, replaced by the frightening possibility that one honest conversation could undo everything she had worked to preserve. She knew Jayden's questions would not end tonight. They had only just begun. Perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't that two brothers had been separated by lies. It was that both of them had lost years they could never recover. One carried the pain of being misunderstood. The other carried the guilt of believing someone who had never stopped protecting him. And somewhere between those two broken hearts stood a truth that refused to stay buried forever. If you were Jason, would you finally tell Jayden everything Clara did, even if it destroyed the life he had spent years building? Or would you continue protecting your younger brother from a truth that could change him forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your perspective might be very different from someone else's. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Because in episode 4, the silence finally begins to break. One private conversation, one forgotten piece of evidence, and one unexpected confession will force the Brooks family to confront a truth that has remained hidden for years. And when that truth finally comes into the light, nothing about their lives will ever be the same again.